Have Jews really been expelled from 109 countries? If you've used the internet for more than 30 seconds, you've likely come across some anti-Semitic nonsense. No social media site is safe. Take this charming little comment. The number 109 seems harmless and random, but it's a neo-Nazi calling card, shorthand for the lie that Jews have been expelled from 109 countries. It's gross and a lie, but it's also a weaponization of Jewish history, because the Jewish people have suffered multiple expulsions. And seeing this huge number invites an impressionable viewer to wonder, why did Jews get expelled so many times? So in the interest of dispelling the noise, let's get one thing straight. Jews have not been expelled from 109 countries. That particular count comes from an Australian hate website that spent some time in court for claiming that Jews exaggerated the death toll of the Holocaust. See, the 109 myth double dips, counting individual towns as separate countries, conflating an expulsion with another form of persecution, or in some cases, just making up claims out of thin air. But what's that old saying? A lie can travel around the globe while the truth is still putting on its shoes? The 109 trope has spread far and fast. And not just because hatred is a virus. The most effective lies are the ones that contain a kernel of truth. And the 109 trope does just that. It twists verified historical facts around on themselves, turning the traumas of Jewish history into fodder for anti-Semites to justify their hatred. The 109 trope gives anti-Semites plausible deniability. We're not anti-Semites, they can claim. We're just pointing out a pattern. Obviously, this is nonsense, and we'll get to why. Let's talk about that pattern first. It's the nature of an empire to conquer and displace and destroy. So when the Assyrians sacked the northern kingdom of Israel, they hauled off most of its Jewish inhabitants. Less than 2 centuries later, the Babylonians repeated the drill, conquering Jerusalem and sending its people into exile. But the worst expulsion of all came at the courtesy of the Roman Empire. First, they destroyed the Holy Temple, leaving Jerusalem in ruins. A few decades later, they brutally crushed a Jewish revolt, sending most of Judea's Jews into an exile that would last nearly 2,000 years. And that is where our story begins. Because an exiled and displaced people are an easy target. A homeland provides a type of safety, the kind of safety denied to the stateless and the dispossessed. So whether they put down roots in Spain or Poland, Yemen or Germany, the Jewish people were acutely conscious of their status as guests in another nation's homeland. But here's the thing about guests, they aren't always welcome. And across the world, but particularly in Christian Europe, Jews were reminded constantly that their welcome was conditional. It didn't matter that Jews had been living in Spain since the 1st century CE, in Germany since the 4th, that they'd been invited to England in the 11th century. They may have lived in these countries, may have enjoyed certain privileges and protections, which we'll get into in a second, but they were Jews. And in Christian Europe, Jew might as well have been shorthand for other. Why? Well, for one, Jews were often the only minorities around, which made them an obvious target. I mean, think about it. Most modern hate groups don't confine themselves exclusively to hating one group, right? Equal opportunity haters, I like to call them. But the average Christian in medieval Europe was short on options. And so whenever anything went wrong, they trained their anger and fear on the single available scapegoat, the Jews. The Jewish people owe their survival in part to their refusal to assimilate. We're stubborn, we're proud, and we're not going anywhere. It's one of the things I love so much about our history. We cling to our religion and traditions despite our neighbors' most insistent attempts to save us. But over the centuries, said neighbors took that personally, and they had quite a robust arsenal of ways to make us see the light, like burning books, or synagogues, or people, or like forcing rabbis to defend Judaism and the Talmud in rigged public debates, which often ended in book burnings, executions, expulsions, and other totally reasonable consequences for losing a debate. Or like barring Jews from participating in most professions, or owning land, or living among Christians. You're probably familiar with the ghettos and the yellow stars of Nazi Europe. But guess what? The Nazis didn't invent either of those. It was 8th century Muslim rulers who decreed that Jews, as well as other non-Muslims, should be wearing identifying clothing. Medieval Christian Europe took it a step further with yellow stars and ghettos. The more you know. But the most effective tool in their arsenal? Expulsion. Now you might be wondering, if Christian Europe hated Jews so much, why didn't they just make them all leave in the first place? Why invite them in, as in the case of England, just to make them miserable and later kick them out? Or you might be thinking bigger, asking, why did they hate Jews so much in the first place? These are the million-dollar questions. And yes, I'm purposely referencing money here, because we're going to talk about three major sources of animus against Jewish people. And the first both explains why Jews were temporarily welcomed in some talk about three major sources of animus against Jewish people. And the first both explains why Jews were temporarily welcomed in some European countries, as well as why they were subsequently expelled. Number one, money talks. Remember when I said that Jews were barred from lots of professions, including farming and owning land? Well, that forced them into a couple of niches that turned out to be kind of essential for running a kingdom, like trade and goldsmithing and medicine and all things financial. And yes, this is where the stereotype of the money-hungry Jew comes from. It's got nothing to do with Judaism and everything to do with the fact that for centuries we had few options but to be moneylenders, tax collectors, or bankers. See, back in the day, European Christians took the biblical prohibition on charging interest really seriously. And while it's nice not to have to pay interest, I see you everyone out there with student loans, charging interest is kind of key to running a modern economy. But you know who could charge interest to Christians? You guessed it, Jews. Which meant that Jewish people were more or less the backbone of Christian Europe's economy. Plus, they could be taxed heavily. Some rulers even required the Jews to pay a special tax just for, existing. In the 18th century, for example, Prague's Jews were required to pay a toleration tax. Yep, they had to pay for the privilege of merely being tolerated by a society that hated them. Nice, right? And by the way, this wasn't just a Christian thing. Jews under Muslim rule were subject to a jizya tax levied against all non-Muslims.
Jizz?
In short, Jews were economically valuable. And because they lent money to nobles and kings, they often received special protections from the crown. Now, before you get excited, because special protection sounds kinda nice, let me be clear. This was not a good thing. True, life in the Middle Ages wasn't a picnic for anyone, what with the king having absolute power and all. Still, Jews had a different legal status from Christians and Muslims, and in some countries, they were literally the property of the crown. So if, for example, the guy in charge, and yeah, it was usually but not always a guy, wanted to economically destroy the Jewish community, he totally could. But why would a king want to bankrupt his moneymen? Isn't that cutting off his nose to spite his face? Well, sort of. But European Christian rulers weren't always great at long-term thinking. Take the 13th century King of England, Edward I. King Eddie liked all the regular stuff. Pina coladas, getting caught in the rain, waging very expensive wars against his neighbors. Turns out armies don't come cheap. So Edward heavily taxed and borrowed from the Jews. But money doesn't grow on trees, as my parents like to remind me. And after years of war, the Jewish community just didn't have the cash. Now here's the bit about poor long-term thinking. Instead of, making it easier for moneylenders to do their job, he decided to get rid of Jewish moneylenders altogether. He stripped the Jews of their ability to loan money, then canceled all debts owed to them, effectively bankrupting the Jewish community. Some special protection, huh? Once the Jews were no longer economically useful, Edward decided to kick them out of England entirely. And that's why there were no Jews in England from 1290 to 1650. They'd been exploited and bled dry, and then sent packing thanks to a few strokes of a quill from a power-hungry king. The Jewish expulsion from England, or from any country, had nothing to do with Jewish behavior and everything to do with their uneasy status as guests in others' countries. Number two, going mad with power. Jews weren't the only undesirables in Europe. You might remember from high school history that medieval Europeans really liked fighting each other over religion.
Religion. Almost like it's the root of all evil. Yeah. Alright boys, we're done. No further links. Alright, no further linkos.